Event on the future of the private rented sector, looking at how the Renters Reform Bill might offer greater security and accountability to the rental market. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Will Tanner. I have the great pleasure of being the director of Onward. And if you don't know about Onward, we are a centre-right think tank focused on levelling up opportunity and strengthening community in every part of the United Kingdom, and particularly in those places where opportunity and community have maybe perhaps been scarce commodities in recent years or decades. And I just want to start today's discussion by just thanking our panel for joining us to discuss today's subject, and particularly to Shelter for helping us put on this discussion, for allowing us to bring together all of you and this group of panelists to talk about such an important subject. Around 10 million people in the UK currently live in the privately rented accommodation in England, sorry. Private rental sector is bigger than all but 3 of the 28 EU countries, I think is I'm right in saying at the moment. And the 2019 Queen's speech set out a commitment to introduce a new deal for renting, including the abolition of Section 21 no-fault evictions, introduction of lifetime deposits, measures to drive up conditions in the private rented sector. The 2021 general election obviously meant that Parliament did not legislate in that session, but the government has committed to bringing back the Renters Reform Bill in this session. And the question, after frankly nearly 2 years of disruption, hardship for many people, especially in the private rental sector, I think we can agree, is how to ensure that that piece of legislation really delivers for tenants in terms of giving better protection, higher levels of standards, but also for landlords as well, in order to ensure greater accountability, certainty in the market, a fair deal for both sides of the marketplace. And to discuss those questions, I'm delighted to introduce an esteemed panel, and I suspect this will be the moment where I largely shut up and I hand over to them to lead us through the discussion. But our first speaker will be Eddie Hughes. He's the Minister for Rough Sleeping and Housing in the new Department for Levelling Up Housing and Community, which is affectionately being called DLUSH, I think, by some people. And Eddie is the surviving minister in that department. He is not one of the speakers on Onward Fringe who's only been in their brief for 19 days. He is someone who has been there for some time and knows the brief intimately. I will then come to Leah Nietzsche, who's the Member of Parliament for Great Grimsby, and then I will turn to Holly Neat, the CEO of Shelter, and Tamara Sandel, Policy and Campaigns Manager at the Chartered Institute for Environmental Health. We only have until around 11:15 this morning, so I'm very conscious of making sure that we use that time wisely. I'm going to leave my introductions there, and I'm going to hand over to each of our speakers to set out around 5 minutes or so of opening remarks before we have an open question and answer session. So Eddie, can I turn to you first? I'd love to hear your reflection on this important subject.
Thanks very much, Will, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Incredibly important to me, you joining us, because as a minister we get lots of opportunity to speak to officials and hear their view on how things should work. Fortunately, as part of the development of the white paper that will go with this better deal for renters, we're reaching out to other people. Polly is, I'm delighted to say, one of the people who's contributing to that discussion. So we're having what is called round tables, but turns out to be square boxes on Teams instead at the moment. I'm looking forward to meeting people in real life. But we've been having discussions with members of the sector representing all elements of it to try to make sure that as we develop the policy, there are no unintended consequences of the things that we're considering. And it seems there could be an opportunity for those unintended consequences with the different constituent elements. So, for example, if we start the position where we think landlord bad, tenant good, because we're all concerned about making sure people have a decent place to live, then the approach that we might take might mean that we become too stringent on landlords and force them out of the market, whether they're good or bad, just because actually the maths don't add up for them anymore. So we need to make sure that we strike that balance to make sure we drive the rogue landlords out of the market, or at least improve the offer that they give, whilst at the same time making sure that renters have a secure place, a decent home to live in. The figure that Will mentioned, though, is significant. We've seen the market massively increase to that figure where we're at 11 million people, or 19% of households living in the private rented sector. So it's clearly a significant market for us to approach. And there are some other things that we're considering doing as well, and I go back to the unintended consequences. So the idea of a lifetime deposit, because clearly when one tenancy ends, a tenant will need to move into a new property, but we know there's a lag between them getting back their original deposit, but they'll want to move straight into a new property. So how do we bridge that gap? Well, if the way we bridge that gap, for example, were through some financial product, then you might be putting a greater financial burden on people who are already in a difficult financial position. So we need to make sure that that works. So I say, the point of me being here today is as much to hear your thoughts so that we can make sure that as we develop this very significant piece of policy, we do a good job of it and get policy that's fit for purpose for a very long time to come.
Eddie, thank you very much. And that really does underscore just how timely this event is. This is a moment at which the government is reflecting and considering its options, looking to make sure that policy is made in the best possible way. So I'm delighted to be able to hold this event now at a point where we can hopefully inform that thinking and give you material that can lead to better policy. That's exactly what Onward is for. Can I now come to Leah to give your perspective?
Yes, good morning everybody. Obviously, I reflect what Eddie's just said, but I have to say in my constituency work, thankfully I have had no issues with anybody being evicted or problems with landlords and tenants. Now that might be because people maybe not getting in touch with me, but certainly that's not something that I'm seeing. What I would like to see is actually the private rented market, there being some market available products so people can actually start to be able to have an option to get shares in their own home. I would like to see a UK where actually nobody has to rent if they don't want to, and they can get on the property market or one way or the other. Now, in an area like Great Grimsby, we have relatively low house prices, and actually it's relatively easy to get onto the housing ladder. I know that's not the same everywhere, but certainly that's something that I've been talking to Onward and other larger housing associations about. What can we do to look at different ways and different products to try and move away from a paternalistic way of people being tenants and people starting to have to build assets, because we know that quite often people are in a situation where they can't move on or they can't get into their own properties because they don't have assets with which to actually move on with. And so I'd like to see the marketplace and the larger landlords actually starting to look at that. As Eddie has said, obviously we've got some very good landlords as well, so we don't want to demonise all landlords as being bad landlords, because we have some very good small landlords with maybe only a very small portfolio of homes who really do care and look after their tenants. But we also need to support our councils, because ultimately when there are things going wrong in tenanted households, it's our councils that intervene. So again, we need to make sure that they have got enough teeth to be able to make sure that people are living in houses that are of a very high quality.
Leah, thank you very much. And actually just to...
Time for clapping, have you? We're on a schedule.
I normally do the applause at the end of the so we will do it intermittently. But just to build on something you just said, Leah, so Onward's work, which actually has been supported by Shelter, looking at how to strengthen the social fabric of communities, has found very clearly that secure tenancy, by which we term kind of ownership and social housing together, is very strongly correlated with a stronger sense of community and social fabric, whereas private renting isn't. And there's a very clear statistical correlation between those two things. So I think your point about focusing on both asset ownership and social housing together, I think, is very, very well made. Can I now turn to Holly?
Yeah, thank you. Just to say as well, I think it's fantastic that the Prime Minister has brought the levelling up agenda and housing together in one department. I think that has huge promise. And as Will says, you know, our homes are absolutely fundamental to our sense of belonging, to our sense that we're invested in our communities and our country, and then our sense of pride in that. And I think bringing housing together with levelling up is a great move, and I'm quite excited about what we might see as a result of that in housing policy. And I just want to focus on, you know, who we're talking about here, because we at Shelter talk about the private rented sector a lot, and sometimes it seems as though we're ignoring the fact that a huge number of landlords have actually bent over backwards during the pandemic to support their tenants during what has been an incredibly difficult time. And I actually know, even from my own family, people who have been supported, huge amounts of flexibility from landlords. The problem we've got, though, is that when we talk about the private rented sector now, the reality of that has shifted massively over the last 20 and even more so 10 years. And we're not talking about, when I at Shelter talk about private renters, I'm talking about the people who we support. And these are not the traditional renters who are on the cusp of home ownership. And we see every day, you know, young people who are well into their 30s still sharing a house with strangers with absolutely no hope of getting on the property ladder. We see families on low incomes who are cutting back on food and heating and other essentials in order to pay their rent. People who are living in the quarter of private rented homes that don't meet the decent home standard. 3/4 of private renters with children have got no savings at all. And there are 750,000 older people, 1/3 of whom are living in poverty once their rent has been paid. And again, they have no opportunity at the moment to get on the home ownership ladder, as Leah was talking about. And we really do need to think about these people, not only when we look at the private rented sector, but when we look at the wider housing policy arena, as I think Leah was saying. Because these are not people, as I said, on the cusp of home ownership. These are people on the cusp of homelessness. And it simply can't be right, then, that people in those sort of situations can be evicted for no reason at all. One more thing, though. Both landlords and tenants are caught in a no-hope system where if somebody is evicted, temporary accommodation is effectively permanent, and there is a net deficit every year in terms of new homes that people on low incomes can actually afford. So in terms of genuinely affordable social homes, we're actually going backwards. There's a net deficit at the moment. I do understand that social homes are being built, but when you look in the round, we are losing social homes year on year. And so, you know, private renting does need to be reformed because it does need to accommodate a group of people who, you know, most people still, when they think of the stereotype of private renting, those people nod their heads. But I also would really urge the new department, DLUSH or DLUC, or whatever it's called, to join up not only levelling up in housing, but its ambition to end homelessness, with its ambition to reform the private rented sector and to deliver properly affordable homes that people on low incomes can actually live in and thrive in and achieve that sense of belonging and pride in. So we do need a set of reforms. We also need them in context, and I think the new department is the perfect place to do that thinking.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. I'm sure and I'm sure Eddie will reinforce what you just said about the department being the ideal place for lots of this going to be to occur in the future. I mean, I think that's exactly the reason why the Prime Minister made some of the decisions that he did. Tomorrow, last but not least.
Thank you. I think the Renters Reform Bill, of course, presents an incredible opportunity to improve housing conditions. Housing has a big impact on health. Poor housing in general costs the NHS about £1.4 billion every year. And I think it's important to see this bill as an opportunity and see it through that lens. The private rented sector does have more poor conditions than other sectors. That 23% of private rented sector homes are below standard, and 13% have a serious Category 1 hazard where it's dangerous for the person living there. And I think Section 21 being abolished is a key move to improve housing conditions. Tenants who are more secure in their homes are more likely to challenge poor conditions without the fear of being evicted. And Section 8 also needs to be reformed to provide that balance for landlords when they need to take the property back. But all of those grounds need to be looked at really carefully to ensure that that balance is there and that those other grounds aren't being used as a sort of route to Section 21 again. So there's proofs that need to be given when someone wants to sell the property, for example. But we're also here to represent the regulators, the environmental health practitioners who work up and down the country within local authorities. They work with landlords and with tenants to inspect and improve property conditions, which are dangerous. We know that resources within local authorities have been tightened over the years, definitely over the last decade, and the last workforce survey we've done shows that the average local authority has about 1 to 3 environmental health practitioners working within it, covering tens of thousands of private rental sector homes. However, we think an initiative that could help improve the efficiency at which the local regulators operate would be the introduction of a national landlord register. This is because what happens at the moment is that 320 local authorities all have to research and collect data on their landlords. They have no good picture of how many private rental properties there are in their areas. And sometimes with really complicated chains of ownership, it can take significant resource and time to find the landlord and their contact details to be able to serve notice on them. So definitely efficiency of savings there. But the register would also bring together all the key information for prospective tenants before they sign their tenancy agreement. They'd be able to see whether the property has a valid gas certificate, an electrical safety certificate, and any other relevant matters and management of the property. But I don't think the landlord would have to provide anything additional to what they already should hold as a landlord. But this information can really be brought together to speed up the process for regulators and give tenants the information they need to make an informed decision about where they live.
Lauren, thank you very much. So that has been a fantastic set of opening remarks. We've heard about the problem, the 25% of privately rented homes that fall below the decent home standard, the 13% that have a serious Category 1 hazard, which was a number that I have not heard before, and that is quite a big number, given we're talking about 11 million homes. And problems not just on the tenant side, but also on the landlord side. As Polly said, landlords bent over backwards. They've enjoyed government regulations to prevent them from doing certain things over the last year and a half for good reasons. But we also need to make sure that the market is working for them and that good landlordism is being incentivised and rogue landlordism is being driven out of the market, as Eddie said. So we've heard about some of the problems and some of the solutions. I'm interested in the idea of a national register and keen to discuss that. But before I ask my question of using the position of chair, let me open up to the floor and see if anyone particularly wants to come in. We've got lots of questions. Okay, so could I take the gentleman there first? I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time just to make sure we get as many people in as possible. The gentleman there, the man to his left, and the woman standing in that order. So you first. So yeah, yes.
Sorry, do I wait for Mark or just go?
Oh no, sorry. So the man behind you, the
sorry.
third row. Sorry.
Let me just declare my interest. I'm a landlord. I've got a small portfolio and I've been there for 20 years. The home truths are that property landlord ownership doesn't actually make much profit. You're dependent on capital values. And there are lots of regulations, and I'm actually fed up and I want to get out of the market now totally because of all this regulation. If there are rogue landlords, the problem is the council, because they have the powers already to do things about it, but they don't. they're passing the buck to us, and that just isn't going to wash in the long term. There are a lot of people with social housing, poorer people who need social housing, but that should be the job of the council. The councils have sold off all their housing stocks and they've got nothing left. So really, you're asking the wrong question here. It shouldn't be the private landlord that has to carry the can. I mean, I'm already paying for my own social thing more than the council pay because I'm subsidising them. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You need to come up with a solution that is sustainable, and this isn't. Because you'll just drive people like me out of the market because I'm not interested, because I'm not a social service. I'm here to run a small business effectively, so why should I subsidise?
Okay, thank you for your contribution. Gentleman here.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest,
sorry, the gentleman behind you. There are way too many hands going.
Is that me? Yeah. Okay. So I have my foot in two camps, because on the one hand I am a former solicitor, former housing solicitor. I run a consultancy called Legal Mentor. On the other hand, I'm the one Conservative councillor in Lambeth where we have a huge issue with social housing. So I first, when people talk about the number of private rented sector houses which are substandard, I often think, well, what's the number of social substandard council housing? Because in Lambeth, they don't collect their own statistics on how poor they are. And it's incumbent on councillors like me. People will email me from across the borough because none of the Labour councillors who've been there for decades will do anything about social housing conditions. So, partly because I know about the law, and so they email me and I get involved and try and help them. But I think the issue really is, as the gentleman says, around councils enforcing. So what my suggestion with my councillor hat on is that, in my experience, councils don't allocate the correct resources to enforcement of housing standards in the private rented sector. What I would suggest, which I think would really work, and I'm very grateful for the comments made by everyone, I'm reassured by the comments made by Eddie about the bill, which is a very sensitive process. What I would suggest is that the government ring-fence a grant for enforcement in the private rented sector. Because very often you'll have 2 council officers or 4 council officers enforcing across a huge area like Lambeth or Lewisham or wherever, and they simply don't have enough staff. If you ring fence that amount for an increase, then not only is it a win for the government, where you can say, look, we're enforcing against bad landlords, we're helping tenants, but something will actually happen. You have the government has many of the laws that it needs in order to bear down on rogue landlords. It's just about enforcing them, it's about finding a way of doing that. So a grant which was ring-fenced, which couldn't be spent on anything else, I think would achieve that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the women standing at the side, and I will try and get as many people in as possible. So,
thank you. Yeah, I agree a lot with what these gentlemen said. The first gentleman in particular, I think is it Polly from shouting, said about sort of not wanting to demonise landlords, but unfortunately it is what is happening. And I speak as a local councillor, but also as a private landlord, and I have worked in social housing as well. And unfortunately, private landlords are being demonised, and I try to do a very good job and look after my tenants. I do run HMOs, so as you were saying about Section 21 and it being a no-fault way of evicting someone, I can guarantee 9 times out of 10 landlords do not want to evict tenants. They want tenants in their properties. You don't use Section 21 because you just feel like getting rid of that tenant. Unfortunately, there is normally blame, and it is unfortunate the landlord feels that's the only route possibly, because the other routes which we should be able to use are just so difficult and timely and costly. And if I just take an example of an HMO where you may have someone living in there who's moved in not long, is taking someone else's milk, is taking a few slices of bread every day. Do you really think a judge is going to evict that tenant for that? But unfortunately, that has a really big knock-on effect on the other tenants that live there and their quality of life, and they will just end up leaving. We end up with a house full of thieves, if you like, and of low quality housing. So we want to sort of support the people that are living there and doing the right thing. Unfortunately, the people that aren't, need to sort sort of learn from those mistakes and move on, we will try and help them with that. But, you know, I think getting rid of Section 121 is not the answer. And,
Thank you very much. So I'm going to now come back to our panel, and I'll come back to the audience for questions. But this has got to one of the kind of biggest questions of this whole debate, which is whose responsibility is it? Do landlords have a responsibility to provide some of that social fabric, or is this entirely a council enforcement problem, or are there more things that we should be asking tenants to do? I think there's a kind of, and also what is the role for national government? So there's a kind of really big question that's kind of been surfaced in all three of those questions, I think. So if I can come to Eddie first, and then I'll come to the other panellists as well. I know Polly will want to come too.
Yeah, I probably won't tackle them perhaps in the order that they were asked. With regard to ring fencing money for councils, one of the problems that we have is that there will perhaps during the course of this conference have been 10 other meetings very similar to this where a gentleman or lady in the audience might have said, you know, the councils would work better if we just ring fence the grant for this thing. And unfortunately, you just end up ring fencing everything, and that would mean that we were deciding from the centre how much money should be spent in each of the hundreds of councils across the country on particular things. And that management from the centre simply doesn't and can't work.
There are about 30 ring fence grants that go to local authorities.
So you want another one, and then another one, and then another one.
I just think it will work. I just think it will work.
We're trying to move to the point where we trust councils. All I hear from councils is there is too much grant funding, we have to apply for it, we compete for it. Why don't you just trust us, give us the money and let us decide how best to spend it locally? So that's what you're hearing. The difficulty when you're in government, unfortunately, is that you have to listen to everybody and then come up with what is hopefully the best solution for the most number of people. And so the idea of ring fencing grants for any kind of function of the council, any more than we already do, would be a difficult thing to achieve. You need to trust local council to do that. However, the other thing I would say though is with regard to things like a landlord register, we're late to the table. This already exists in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and my understanding is that that hasn't decimated the rental market in those areas. Everybody hasn't just sold up and gone out of that market, so there must be some room for simply collating information that you already have to provide, as was said by Tamara, with regard to things like the EPC certificate. Do you have an electric certificate? Do you have a gas certificate? We're simply trying to collect that information in a place because councils don't know where all of their landlords are, and it would be very helpful for them to know that in order to be able to maximise the efficiency of how they enforce it. I just wanted to say as well, one of the exciting things about being the minister or having the ministerial responsibility I do is I'm the minister responsible for private rented sector reform, but I'm also the minister responsible for the social housing white paper, and I completely take the point that we need to absolutely make sure that particularly big landlords, we'll have seen some dreadful stories recently on Central News with regard to social housing landlords not delivering the quality of accommodation that we would expect, and certainly not delivering on that social element of being a social landlord. So there's work to be done. We're addressing both of those points, and I would just reassure people in the room that the discussion is ongoing. We're in the middle of the formulation of policy, and we're listening to lots of people to make sure that we get a rounded view when we publish the white paper.
And can I just very quickly, before I come to Leah perhaps, can I just ask, just on your final point, is there a case for any register, also including the social rented sector there too?
I think all options are being considered.
Interesting. Thank you. Leah, can I come to you?
Well, I mean, I have to declare an interest because I'm a landlord. I'm an accidental landlord. In the crash of 2007, 2008, I wanted to sell a house, and the person who wanted to buy my house had 2 houses to sell because they were joining a family together. So I took a part exchange, and so I ended up with a little property. But it did surprise me that when we were looking at getting tenants, that actually you were left to your own devices in a lot of cases. We decided to rent through a reputable estate agent, who made sure they talked us through all of the things that we needed, like our gas certificate, our electricity, all of those kind of things, making sure that the house was maintained. And it did surprise me with registering for council tax that actually there is nothing that the council does know about who ultimately is the owner of that home. And so we could really do something just by altering how we register with our local council's council tax to say that actually ultimately, yes, this is the person who will be paying the council tax in the house, but they're not the ultimate owner, and there is somebody else there. So I do agree with a registered landlord's a register. But what we need to do is make sure that councils are able to effectively and quickly make changes. And I understand people are in the property market to make money, but also there is a moral judgment there as well. The only constituents I've had come to me have been landlords who've had terrible difficulty with really bad tenants, and have really struggled to get those tenants out. However, what I would say, and I said to the handful that I've had in that situation, was that, well, when you actually step back to look at what they did in order to get that tenant, they really didn't go into it with their eyes open. They didn't go through an agent or anybody reputable, so third party. It gets very difficult. We made that choice because we didn't want to have a direct contact and then potentially clashes between yourself and the tenant. They didn't take references properly. They didn't go in with their eyes wide open. And then when they had a terrible tenant, my question to them was, well, why are you surprised at this? So that the whole process actually needs to be much more open, and you're not going to make profit all of the time. I know people want to make money. I didn't go in it to make money, but this year, I'm updating the boiler and I'm updating the bathroom. Next year, it will probably be the kitchen, but as a good landlord, that's what I am doing, and I probably won't make any profit for the next 2 or 3 years, but I'd rather make sure I've got a really good looked after tenant in the house, because the tenant I currently have is excellent, and I've only had 4 tenants in the whole period, and I had 1 bad tenant, and boy, when you have a bad tenant, you really do know you have a bad tenant, and they can do some really serious dire things to your property that do cost you a lot of money. So I do think that structurally we do need to look at making it more structured for people to become landlords, certainly so people come into it with their eyes open, and the contracts between landlord and tenant. You don't want somebody who's going to be in your house thieving things from other people or thieving things from yourself. So therefore in your contract, my contract with my tenant is very clear. They cut the grass, they keep the house maintained to a certain level, obviously the things that we need to do as well. But my agent goes in every 3 months and they do a checklist and they make sure, and if they're not doing it, then we start to have conversations. So, we really need to be grown up about what being a landlord and what being a tenant means as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Polly?
On this point about demonising landlords, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think if you're a member of any group or community and you have somebody like Shelter continually pointing out where people are not living up to the proper standards that community should live up to, it doesn't feel good, and I completely understand that. I guess that's why I opened my remarks by saying that I'm absolutely aware of landlords who have done everything possible during the pandemic to be fair to their tenants. The problem we've got is at the moment, a lot of people, as I said in my opening remarks, are in a totally unsatisfactory situation, and they don't have sufficient recourse for that, and they can be evicted very easily, and they do then become homeless. So that is happening. Also, the good landlords are happening, and that's why this is so complex. I guess the other thing I would say is that, as Eddie said, we are the outlier in the UK, in England, in the way in which we deal with private renting. If you look in Scotland, where you have more secure tenancies, it does show that the market trends have remained the same and are the same as in England. In terms of our social homes, substandard 2, Yes, they absolutely are. Of course they are. We helped with the ITV, I don't know, you must have all seen the ITV bits of it, investigation in standards in social homes. Absolutely appalling and unforgivable. And of course councils do need to enforce that. On the point about ring-fenced grant, totally. I think we are in a national emergency when it comes to housing, and it does require government action. It requires government investment in social homes. It requires support, ring-fence funding so that councils can enforce their responsibilities, and it does require intervention in terms of the National Register. And this is a situation now where I don't think there's any option but to see strong action from the government, but also visionary action. What we need, and everyone's right who's saying that social homes are just as bad, if not worse in some cases, what we need is a new vision for housing that includes investment in a new generation of social homes, where you've got where they can meet environmental standards, where people who actually can't afford to live in the private rented sector, that's the root of the problem, right? People actually can't afford it. So, but there isn't anywhere for them to go, and a B&B in temporary accommodation isn't okay for a family who can't afford their private rented home. So we have to think about this in the round, and I guess that's why I was saying in my opening remarks that I'm so excited about the new department bringing functions together, that I think we'll be able to look at what is now an emergency in the round and understand that yes, local authorities need to be independent, yes, local areas are different, absolutely, but we also do need central government action on this issue, otherwise it isn't going to go away.
Laura, do you want to carry on this?
Yes, very briefly, as I'm conscious other people have questions, I'm really surprised, pleasantly so, that there's so much support for a national register. I think there's support bubbling up all over the sector, and it's something that is definitely something that people are thinking about at the moment. In terms of council funding, we absolutely need more funding for enforcement of housing standards. Rogue landlords are tackled by councils, and some councils are very proactive, and that's directly linked to their funding because often it's in the selective licensing areas where local authorities go out and actually inspect all their properties in that one small area, and they find lots of room for improvement. So there is definitely that relationship, and something needs to happen with training more environmental health practitioners. There are recruitment challenges at the moment, and we're trying to lobby for an apprenticeships fund for local authorities who haven't been training the next generation of enforcers. Only 50% of local authorities have a trainee or an apprentice in environmental health, and that's a problem because you don't have the people to recruit from. And in terms of the register, again, I think the cost to the landlord should be relatively small. Looking at Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, those costs are not large. They're not like selective licensing costs, and that's why I think the register should be a good option.
Can we have rents for road tenants?
Sorry, I'm just going to try. So we've had a couple of questions from landlords or from people. So you've asked a question. I'm going to try and get lots of people trying to get in. So is there anyone representing tenants or tenants themselves? So just
generation rent.
Yeah, there are a few people that said. So I'm going to take three. That means literally two sides of the room. I'm going to take three questions here. The woman in black on the second row, then the woman immediately behind her, and then the woman 2 seats down. That's okay. So Dave.
Great, no, thank you for holding this discussion. My name's Caitlin. I work for Generation Rent, the campaign for private tenants. I'm also a private tenant myself. My question is around the possibility of landlords leaving the market, as several people have mentioned. Now, obviously, we want to avoid unintended consequences, but would a gradual shrinking of the private rented sector necessarily be a bad thing, is my question. We've heard that social housing and home ownership is much more cohesive. Many people, especially of my generation, want to get on the housing ladder. And if a landlord sells a property, it's very unlikely that they're going to bulldoze it when they go. They might sell it to a first-time buyer or sell it to another landlord. So I guess my question is, looking at these reforms in long term, should we be looking to keep the private rented sector as large as it is, or would a gradual shrinking be something that could actually be beneficial?
Thank you very much, Kevin. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've heard about the
So
issues.
where are you from?
Oh, sorry. My name is Mabel Flanagan. I'm from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We've heard about the discussions around Section 21 and possible scrapping of that. But actually, in the wake of the pandemic, 2/3 of cases going through possession courts are on ground 8, which is about 2 months' rent arrears, and it's a mandatory ground, so judges have no discretion as to what to do in those situations. So my question to the Minister is, are you considering looking at ground 8 as a mandatory ground to deal with the fact that the impact of COVID on people's ability to pay rent isn't going away anytime soon?
Thank you very much. And to Dan, yeah.
Hi, my name's Rianne. I'm here from Age UK. I want to say thank you to the panel for this event and to Shelter for putting on. I wanted to pick up on something Leah said, which was, I thought, really important, that you said you don't actually hear from a lot of tenants who come forward to you and share their problems with you. And I think this is something that we hear from talking to a lot of older private renters. Polly said there are 750,000 older private renters in the UK, and they don't feel like they can come forward when they're putting up with unsuitable housing, damp, disrepair, because they've been evicted before, they know what things are like, and they feel like they will be evicted from their home if they do this. Particularly older private renters put up with chronic health conditions, they might need adaptations so they can keep living independently, they don't feel like they can ask for them. So I suppose my question is, what can we do to better protect older private renters, make sure they, feel like they can come forward and access things that are there?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to be a bit more directive with who answers questions just in the interest of time, because there are so many hands going up and I want to get in as many as I can. So this first question about would a shrinking of the private rented sector be a good or a bad thing? I'm actually going to pose to Leo if that's okay. We have a much larger private rented sector in some other countries. Is that a good thing? Should we be sorrowful if that starts to decline?
I would like to see fewer rentals out there, but I have to say that depends whether people would like to see. Some people choose to rent; they don't want to buy. So we've got to make sure that people do have that choice. But as I said, one of the many reasons why I'm a Conservative is I believe in home ownership, and I believe that it does make a difference with how you treat your property and what you want to do. But I would say, obviously, that the market is very different in somewhere like Grimsby to central London. So what I would say to people is, come to Grimsby, you can afford a house and you can get a really good job and have a good standard of living. Am I allowed to say things like that? But that's the reality. That is the reality. I know people want to live and work in cities, but when we're talking about the levelling up agenda, there are some really great places to live where you can have a very nice lifestyle and a very nice house and be able to afford it on an ordinary wage, and it doesn't have to be in one of the richest parts of the world, in the centre of the city. So yes, the answer is yes, I would like to see less rented, but that's only if there are fewer people who want to rent.
Leah, thank you very much, and I can testify that Grimsby is on the app with the Grimsby Town Deal and various other things. We've been doing focus groups in Grimsby relatively recently. Eddie, can I come to you on the second question around
Yeah, I think as part of this process, the policy formation, we're talking to everybody, and that includes the court system as well, to understand how best to apply the law and what changes need to be made. I mean, we simply can't be abolishing Section 21 without being mindful about the other consequences that will fall out of that, not least because, just to dwell on Section 21 for a minute, not least because some social landlords need to have that as an option in order to be able to grant people kind of starter tenancies so that they can get into rented accommodation in the first place. So basically we are taking the opportunity to speak to all parties about all elements of the current law and how it's applied, speaking to MOJ as well, to make sure that we don't end up with, as I said, those unintended consequences. But you're absolutely right, there are certain grounds where the judge has no option but to grant, and we need to be mindful of that, so we're considering it.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Polly, I think you might want to come on one of the other questions too, but I'm very interested in both your and Tamara's views on the older renters question, which I think is crucial.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point made there about older renters, and absolutely agree with that. Older renters actually aren't alone in the fact that they don't want to complain about issues with their housing, and the reason for that is Section 21. So we have to do something about that, because there is a direct link between that not wanting to say anything, and the fact that the reason they don't is because of the possibility of a no-fault eviction. I'm not saying that's why most landlords use Section 21, okay? I'm just saying that is a fact, that is how Section 21 is used, because we do see it every day. In terms of the bigger question about the should rental part of the market, private renting, shrink and all of that, so I think this is the older renters issue is part of this big question as well. So of course it's not a bad thing if the private rented sector shrinks if there are alternatives. We don't want to see people in their 50s and 60s in private renting. You know, it's just not appropriate, and eventually when people need aids and adaptations to their homes, for example, that is not an appropriate market for them to be in. You know, right to buy has completely dried up. It used to be a huge proportion of people entering the housing ladder. It now is a minuscule proportion. There's a really obvious reason for that, which I know I keep coming back to like a broken record, but the reason for that is that we're not building social homes, decent social homes, that people on low incomes can afford to rent. If we were, then it would actually help people into home ownership. People would be able to save. I already talked about 3/4 of people with children in private rented sector having no savings at all. That's part of why they're so vulnerable. And we have to join this stuff up and that's why I was again talking about the role of central government and the new department in doing this. We have to have a vision for housing as a whole. And yes, that could well happily include a shrinking of the private rented sector if people had other options that weren't, frankly, a B&B.
Thank you very much, Polly. Tomorrow, and then I'm going to try and bring in everyone.
Very briefly, I mean, older people are definitely more vulnerable to poor housing conditions, excess cold, dangerous stairs. They're the most common hazards that our members find in private rented homes. And older people are most at risk. And they also need the most protection, don't they? Because moving for them is not very easy. It's just like moving for a family who have roots in the community. It's really disruptive, it's expensive. We need to make sure that the sector is fit for purpose and it's safe for everyone living in it, not just one proportion of people. I thought it was a really interesting question from Generation Rent about how big the private rental sector should be. Of course, there are lots of people who should probably be in social housing living in the private rental sector at the moment. Whether they should be living there at all, I'm not sure that they should be. So we should be building much more social housing to give people that security and homes that they can rely on and hopefully better standards than they might find on the open market.
Thank you very much, Mara. Now, there are lots of people who've been waiting for ages, so I'm going to try and bring in as many as I can for a round of questions, and then I'm going to come back to the panellists for their concluding remarks, because we've only got 50 minutes left. So the two gentlemen at the front have been waiting a long time, so here and here, and I'll come to you, sir, here, and then why don't we, interested in the report, so here first.
Okay, so I was a tenant for most of the time my kids were growing up. I was evicted once, but I'm also a landlord. I know the work that Shelter does. I think you do an excellent job, but as you said, it sounds like 70% of the market's working, right? So if you're convinced that the right answer is to limit economic freedom, and you think it's going to help, I think it's not. I think you're going to kind of do damage to the market. And the reason why I believe that is three quick key questions. With the deposit scheme, who is going to eat the risk between when a tenant leaves and a tenant moves to the new place? As a landlord, is a landlord going to be able to increase their rent? Is a landlord going to be able to sell their home? Which was the reason why I was evicted, because my landlord just simply wanted to sell their home. So there is if you wanted to do this at a price level. Set a rent level. Above that, these rules apply. Below that, they don't. Sorry, the other way around.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
As a local landlord, I'm surprised that the most perceptive contribution I've heard is from Shelter. And I think Polly has latched on to what I think is the most important issue, is that the people who are struggling with the cost of rented accommodation. And I think what that points to is not that we should abolish Section 21, what it points to is a major policy mistake from this government and the last one, which is that instead of trying to make rented accommodation cheaper, they've added to the costs of landlords and made rented accommodation more expensive. I'm embarrassed at the moment at the rents I'm charging my tenants, new tenants in Manchester. Rents have gone up drastically just in the last year or two. But then we've had extra things to do as landlords. For instance, just this year, the electrical safety checks, which law-abiding landlord will comply with. But it's not just a question of paying the electrician, it's the time of organising it, and all of that is loaded onto the rent and loaded onto the tenant. And rents are just going up and up and up. And the policy priority should be trying to get market rents down by enabling landlords to offer accommodation more cheaply.
Thank you very much. If I could ask people to keep their remarks quite brief, because I'm just very interested in keeping to time if I can. So, this gentleman here.
Yeah, thanks for the debate. It's been a really interesting, if rather unbalanced debate. First question to the chair, which is, well, why is there not a representative of landlords here? Because they're a big part of the answer.
There was a landlord panel, I should say.
Not a representative of landlords.
Well, so, okay, your point is.
And they're, you know, they're the poor people who are going to have to deal with the legislation. But the other question is really, well, where are the principles behind government policy? There used to be faith in the market. Government intervention since 1997, I think, has made the situation much worse. And I totally fear that the answer is, and this gentleman said it a bit earlier, there's so much existing regulation. Enforcement is the problem. And every politician seems to want a piece of legislation with their name attached to it. But I think that the constant ratcheting up of tenant rights without tenant responsibilities, the ratcheting up of building regulations, again, and the three realities that we need to take into account. Firstly, margins. Margins are hugely important. As this gentleman said, some landlords are existing on zero margins. They're purely requiring capital growth, which means they're going to have to sell it. So, and when home builders are making 25% margins, thanks to government regulations, but landlords making 2 or less percent. So firstly, I'd like to see some evidence of government philosophy, because the last government, George Osborne's bizarre attacks on small landlords, which have made it very hard now to be a very small landlord, and they've increased the extent of the scale. But the second is the problem of irresponsible tenants. I was an accidental landlord like yourself for a short period, and I'd never do it again. The problem of irresponsible tenants, because every tenancy is a contract, and contract law is essential, which is where the attack on Section 21, I think, is very unconservative, because you have a right to, you don't own a property unless you can possess it.
Thank you.
The third thing is the considerable amount of regulation that isn't enforced already that it needs to be dealt with.
Thank you. I think only going to have time to bring in 2 more people. These 2 people at the front have been waiting for the longest time, so I'm going to bring this gentleman here, and they've also put up their hands extremely high. these 2 people here, and then I'm going to come back to the panel for their thoughts, and I'll try and summarise all of these questions. Thank you for all of your remarks. So this gentleman here, and then.
Hi there, my name's Simon. I have a sales and lettings business in Cambridgeshire as an estate agent. I'd just be interested, hopefully to end on a bit of optimism. We can't be the only economy and the only country facing this challenge, and I would just be interested to hear, perhaps as a final comment from everybody on the panel, which countries or economies have a model which we could copy that have managed to solve this housing problem to some degree.
Thank you. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Stella. I work for Crisis, the homelessness charity. I agree with everything Eddie said, and Michael Gove as well spoke yesterday, and I'm very happy with the government's approach to homelessness at the moment. But if I take my professional cap off and I speak as a 27-year-old who pays half my salary goes to rent, and I have no prospect of buying a house anytime soon. I'm also an immigrant, so I don't have any family to help me here. I have a bit of a naive question. It sounds like the landlord opinion is that the money that the landlord makes from being a landlord is supposed to be growing and growing, while the salaries of renters are staying the same year after year. Am I getting this logic right, or am I missing something?
Thank you very much. Okay, so 5 brilliant questions, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. I'm sorry to everyone who I wasn't able to bring in. It's been a really interesting and rich discussion. So the questions, I'm going to apologies if I'm summarising wrongly, but I think there's a question about who is the risk, especially with things like lifetime deposits, and the balance of risk between landlords, tenants, and potentially government. There's a question about the extent to which government regulations made the private rental sector more expensive and more burdensome, and the effect that has actually on rental prices for tenants themselves, and whether or not there's actually a mistaken kind of judgment there. There's the balance, which we've heard about before, between regulation and enforcement, whether or not we actually have all the regulations we need right now, and actually it's just a question of enforcement. And then the final 2 questions are on whether there are international examples we should be looking to. We've already heard about Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but are there others further afield? And also this question about the kind of differential equity between kind of landlords and tenants. If tenants' wages are not rising, should landlords still be expecting to see year-on-year growth in their rental income, for example? I'm not saying you necessarily have seen that, to be fair, but kind of how are we balancing out those interests? I'm going to come to our panel to give concluding thoughts. They may not answer all of those questions, but I'm going to let them choose which ones they want to address specifically. And then I will conclude, because we've only got 5 minutes left. So if I could go from right to left, Tamara, could I potentially come to you first?
Yes, I'll keep it really brief. I think, the devil is in the detail here. We've discussed lots of interesting proposals. They need to be fleshed out. The reasons for eviction need to be fleshed out. We need to look at them in a lot of detail to design a system that works for both landlords and for tenants, because there are good landlords, there are bad landlords, there are good tenants, there are bad tenants. Our members get caught in the middle sometimes. But we also need to bring government regulations together. It seems like there's been a lot of piecemeal additions to responsibilities and standards. Building control regulations don't align with other regulations. So I think some clarity for the whole sector on what we expect housing to look like in the future. We're moving towards a more energy efficient country, hopefully, and we need to be looking forward instead of kind of arguing about what is the minimum standard, where do we draw the line. So that would be my kind of concluding comment.
Thank you, Samara. Polly.
So I'm going to make myself really unpopular, or even more unpopular, I should say. Because, of course, there are good landlords, there are bad landlords, there are good tenants, there are absolutely awful tenants. Of course that's the case. There are good people and bad people, right? And so what we have to do is strike a balance between what different groups of people are able to do in order to create a fair system. And at the moment, the balance of rights within this system, however landlords feel victimised, but the balance of rights within the system are very much on the side of the landlord. Uniquely so.
We've got 4 minutes left.
I really don't like it. I get it. The fundamental problem, and I want to return the compliment to the gentleman at the front, because he's absolutely right. The fundamental problem, though, is that people are struggling with the cost of private renting. At the moment, the government is letting housing benefit and local housing allowance take the strain of that to the tune of £30 billion in a year. That's more than the whole affordable housing programme over its 5 years. That is not, housing benefit is not an investment, no offence to the people who it goes to, and understand why it has to. But people are struggling with private renting. At the moment, we're letting the benefit of the welfare system take the strain. There is another alternative, and that's why I keep talking about the bigger picture here, and the fact that people are in private renting, it shouldn't be.
Thank you very much, Polly. Minister.
Wow, too much to cover in too short a time. Just to say, first of all, with regard to the deposit scheme, we've got some accountants looking at it to work out how that's going to work. The risk won't be carried by the landlord. That will be, it will be a variation of an insurance product or something like that that allows the tenant to effectively have access to the money while the first landlord is deciding how much of it they may retain. We appreciate, but sometimes that's necessary. With regard to policy, I would say, what we are trying to do with things like the landlord register is give, which we are considering, can I say, it's not a policy decision at the moment, is perhaps give councils a better understanding of landlords in their area and where they are, and perhaps then they'll be able to target what is obviously a limited resource on the people who are actually the most problematic, rather than necessarily worrying about other people. And as I said, the landlord register concept is just recording information that's already available in terms of gas and electric certificates. With regard to this extra burden of things like electrical inspection, I would say, and perhaps you might consider this slightly tongue-in-cheek, if you're a good landlord, surely you're getting your property inspected to understand that the electrical installation is good anyway. And if you weren't doing that, then you're taking at least some risk. And the reason I say this is that in a post-Grenfell world, where everybody is far more attuned to keeping people safe in their homes, surely our first and foremost duty is to keep people safe rather than make money. Otherwise, we're not really decent people, I would say. So that obligation, I understand, is there now in a structural way, but actually many people would have been doing some of that stuff anyway. And with regard to what country gets it right, I don't know the answer. Will is one of those super clever people who knows what other countries are up to, so he might be able to give you a view on that. And with regard to the affordability of properties, we are in, this is not a discussion for this group, obviously, with regard to planning reform. The government is determined to build as many houses as we can. We're trying to streamline the planning process so we can do that. I completely understand that many people in the room will want us to build more social housing. Many of the Conservatives at this conference will want us to build more houses to buy. So again, I come back to the point that I made at the start. As a government, you need to try to take the views as many of people as possible and trying to keep lots of people happy. It's difficult.
Very good. Leah, the final word.
I don't believe that it's government's job to make a sector more profitable. If a business isn't profitable and you own the business, well, do something to make it profitable or get out of the business, frankly. And especially when it's a business where it's actually about people's lives. And I wouldn't be able to sleep at night thinking that my tenants couldn't have their heating, or there was a water leak, or there were holes in the wall, or whatever other things are happening. But what I think we do need to do, absolutely, is we do already have the laws there. We need to make sure that our councils and our environmental health teams can actually enforce and speed up that whole enforcement situation, because that's the reason why we're having these discussions, is because sometimes, a minority of times, but things do go horribly wrong, and we need to make sure that people are not in a situation desperately for weeks, months, or potentially years. And that, for me, is the absolute key, is giving our councils and environmental health teams many more teeth.
Fantastic, Leah, that's a brilliant way to end. And thank you so much to our panel for being so open and thoughtful in their remarks, and thank you to all of you for being so vocal, but also provocative with your questions. This is exactly why we hold events like this at Party Conference. It's exactly why people on the panel turn up to speak at them. It's in order to hear your views and to be questioned in this way, because it leads to much better policy, and that's what Onward exists to do. If anyone wants to engage with Onward, from either the landlords or the tenant side,
it's not one or the other.
Indeed, it's both. It's both. I was being glib, but please do do that. We're doing lots of work on this from both a levelling up perspective and a social fabric perspective, and very keen to hear the views of all of you. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our panel, and if you could join me in giving a final round of applause